Welcome everyone to another video discussion of free answer writing practice by Vajiram and Ravi. In the month of March, we are going to cover GS1, specifically the history and geography aspect, because that is going to be very much of utility for your prelims preparation. For today's video discussion, we are going to see the art and cultural aspect of GS1, where we will be looking at the questions from religion and school of philosophy as well as from literature. Let us see the overview of those questions. The very first question we have is with respect to the Bhakti movement and how it provided criticism against the caste system of India. The second question is with respect to the status of women and how through ancient literature we are able to understand multi-dimensional status of the women of that time. The third question is personality-based question, where we will talk about Shankaracharya and how exactly there was re-emergence of Hindu philosophy, and we will also talk about that how exactly the contribution of Shankaracharya played significant role for the same. So these are the three questions. Let us start with the very first question. Let us read the question number 1 together. Discuss the ways in which Bhakti movement expressed critics of the caste system in India. If you see the question, you can understand how you can structure the introduction, body and conclusion aspect of the answer. The only demand of this question is Bhakti movement's criticism of caste system. So that is going to be your body, and that is the only heading that you have to mention. In the introduction, you can briefly talk about Bhakti movement. Over here, you can talk about the definition of Bhakti. You can give insight about what exactly Bhakti movement refers to. And you can also talk about certain principles of Bhakti movement to give a very holistic idea in the introduction itself. Through the transition, that how it was against certain kind of traditional hierarchy system, that is caste system. And in the body aspect, you can list down the proof points, how exactly it criticized the caste system. In the conclusion, you can talk about the impact of Bhakti movement for the overall social structure. So that is the entire structure of the answer for question number 1. Let us start with the introduction. In the introduction, you can briefly describe what exactly is Bhakti, which refers to the devotion for the divinity. You can also talk about that Bhakti movement refers to mystical union of the individual and the God, and the inception of such kind of movement started around 7th to 8th century. You can also talk about certain principles of Bhakti movement, such as God is one, equality among all, discarding rituals, and against caste system, to imbibe and give a holistic idea that what exactly is Bhakti movement. You can also inculcate this kind of points in the body where there is certain relevance about the criticism of caste system. So that is the introductional aspect of this question number 1. Let us see the body. Over here, you can give the heading as in critics of caste system by Bhakti movement in following ways. Let us start with the very first point. Let us start with the very first dimension as in inclusivity in worship. Bhakti movement propagated the idea that no one should exclude it from the worship of the God, as in no one should be discriminated. So there is certain emphasis on devotion where everyone is allowed to attain that kind of status. We have seen that kind of practice in Kabir's monotheistic preaching for all. Second point you can talk about is criticizing the rituals and ceremony. Now, Bhakti movement's one of the major criticism was through ritual, there is certain kind of gap between the individual and the divinity, and thus rituals must be discarded so that there is direct connection. So there is promotion of personal connection with God. The third you can talk about is promotion of social equality. Bhakti sense there were many efforts to break the social barrier, and thereby the traditional hierarchy of the caste system was also criticized. You can talk about Guru Nanak's interaction across different castes and how his ideas of social reforms helped with respect to certain kind of inclusion. The fourth point you can talk about through literature and poetry. We have seen that Bhakti poets expressed criticism against caste system. You can talk about Tukaram's Abhangs, where he explicitly mentions certain kind of criticism for the caste system. The next point you can talk about is universal access to God. where the God's accessibility is for everyone. We have seen that how certain segment of population which were not that privileged, like Ravidas, they also have certain accessibility to God, and you can understand in the entire spectrum of Bhakti movement that it was totally against the idea of caste system or any kind of traditional hierarchy. And lastly, community building. We have seen that how it was not just individuals pursued, but also something as a collective effort for inclusivity. We have seen that kind of examples in Basavana's effort for welfare state. Now that is all for question number 1 in the body aspect. Let us see the conclusion. In the conclusion, you can talk about the impact of changes brought by the Bhakti movement on the social structure. Over here, you can talk about that not only there were certain kind of criticism for caste system, there were also proof points for proliferation of vernacular language throughout the country, as well as there were certain other religious reforms as well, like empowerment of women and other vulnerable sections. So that is something you can talk about in question number 1's conclusion. This is all for question number 1. Let us see the model answer and understand how can we inculcate all those proof points in our answer writing practice. So, in the introduction, you can briefly talk about the inception of Bhakti movement. You can talk about the definition of Bhakti as well as what exactly is Bhakti movement. You can talk about the major principles in a mind map form as well. Then in the heading 1 of the body, you can talk about the criticism of caste system by Bhakti movement, where you can list down different proof points along with examples. And lastly, in the conclusion, you can talk about the overall impact of Bhakti movement for the entire social structure. So that is all for question number 1. Let's move to question number 2. Let's read the question number 2 together. Throw light upon the politico-social economic status of women with the help of ancient literature. Now again, if you read the question, you will understand the major demand of the question is to understand the status of the women through ancient literature. So if you structure the answer in the introduction, you can talk about the status of women in general, then you can transition that how in ancient India, through ancient literature, we can understand the status, the multidimensional status of women. You can list down different proof points. So that is in the body, the heading 1, in the introduction, status in general, and in the conclusion, you can give a mixed idea about how that idea of status through ancient literature was complex and varied due to variety of reasons, which we will write in the conclusion. So that is the structure of question number 2. Let us start with the introduction. In the introduction, you can briefly talk about the status of women in general. You can talk about it how historically women have a complex idea with respect to the status, where we have seen multiple ups and downs, where there were certain instances in ancient times where women were worshipped. Then we have certain instances where they were discriminated. So we have variety of proof points to give that pattern of the status. Then in the transition, you can talk about that how literature plays important role in understanding the holistic idea of status of women. So literature gives us holistic idea, and thus in the body we will talk about the status of women reflected through ancient literature. Over here you can cite different literature and mention what exactly was there for the women's status. In Rig Veda, we have seen that women were empowered. They were members in sabhas and vidatas. There were no mention of child marriage, and they had respectable position. So over here we are looking at a equal kind of status on par with men. Then in Dharma Shastra, we have seen that there is certain degree of deterioration of women's status. There is certain degree of dependency on the male counterpart. Now, this is a kind of a political as well as social status which reflects that how that dependency did not empower the women, and there was certain degree of discrimination. In the Mahabharata and Ramayanas, we have seen mention of women characters and how they have different varieties of roles. We have seen that there were also certain subservient status for women, as in we have seen certain proof points with respect to Draupadi and Sita, and we have also seen discussion of the sati evil practice. In Anguttara Nikaya, which is part of Sutta Pattika of Buddhism, where emancipation on Buddhism of women is also allowed, where we can talk about that there is certain degree of equality of status. Let's see another literature, which is Manusmriti, where we have seen explicit ideas about the duties and responsibilities of women, and there were also certain restrictions and denial of equal rights. In Puranas, we are looking at certain deterioration of women's status again, where there is dependency of male counterpart and how they were limited to certain places such as temples and their subsequent role as Devdasis. And lastly, we can talk about Sangam literature. In those literature forms, we have seen that how women were in position of power, were rulers and administrators, and were also involved in economic activities such as agriculture. So these are the proof points you can write for the body aspect of this question. Let us move on to the conclusion. In the conclusion, you can talk about that how the status of women in ancient India was complex and varied. That complexity was basically because of their caste association as well as their family background. Now we have seen that how caste played very important role. So there were certain privileged caste and there were certain underprivileged caste. Again, with respect to the family background, you can talk about how there were certain segments where women who come from privileged background, they were having more access to certain resources, and thereby the status was also elevated. And thus, this is the conclusion for question number 2. Let us see the model answer and understand how can we inculcate the same in an answer writing practice. In the introduction, you can give brief idea about the status of women, and you can talk about that how through literature proof points we can understand the multidimensional status of women specifically for ancient times. You can list down different proof points in the body, and in the conclusion you can give that how that idea of status was also complex and varied for different social backgrounds. So that is all for question number 2. Let us move on to question number 3. Let's read the question number 3 together. Shankaracharya brought about a synthesis of ideas and philosophies. In this context, discuss the contribution of Adi Shankaracharya in the development of Hindu philosophy. Now, if you see this question, there are basically 2 demands. The first demand being that Shankaracharya brought about synthesis of ideas and philosophies. So in this body aspect, you can give proof points that how there were certain synthesis of ideas and philosophies. In the body 2, in the heading 2, you can talk about the contribution of Adi Shankaracharya with respect to the development of Hindu philosophy. For the introduction, you can briefly talk about Adi Shankaracharya, the timeline, as well as you can talk about that how he helped with respect to re-emergence of Hinduism and the backdrop of heterodox religions or heterodox sects of Jainism and Buddhism. In the conclusion, you can talk about the significance of the contribution of Adi Shankaracharya for the Indian society. So let us start with the introduction. In the introduction, you can briefly talk about the personality of Adi Shankaracharya. You can talk about that how he initiated certain kind of reforms as in which led to the re-emergence of Hindu philosophy around 8th to 9th century Common Era. So that is something you can talk about here. You can talk about it how he also led to certain ideas and philosophies which provided certain kind of backing for the Hindu philosophy. So that is something you can write as a transitionary statement over here. And in the body, in the heading 1, you can talk about the synthesis of those ideas and philosophies, as that is going to be the major demand. You can list down different proof points, as in he led to the creation of Advaita Vedanta, which is monoism, where there is certain idea with respect to Nirguna Brahman, as in God without attributes. You can talk about the ideation of Brahman, where we have seen that Shankaracharya gave emphasis on single ultimate reality, and any alternative idea is manifestation of Brahman and not something different. You can talk about it how he led to synthesis of philosophies of different schools of Hinduism, such as Yoga by Patanjali. You can talk about it how the idea of logic was taken from Nyaya and Vaishika school of Hindu philosophy, and at the same time the idea of metaphysics from the Samkhya school of Hindu philosophy. So these were the philosophical elements from various schools amalgamated to lead to the creation of Advaita Vedanta. You can also talk about it how ideas from Upanishads and Purans were also integrated, such as different commentaries, and scholarly work. He also led to unified Hindu philosophy, where there were comprehensive idea about different aspects of the society as well as different aspects with respect to the reality. And they were inclusive of teachings of Buddhism and Jainism as well. And through that, there was emphasis on ahimsa and compassion. So these are the kind of synthesis of ideas and philosophies by Adi Shankaracharya. Let us go to the heading 2, which is the second demand of this question, as in contribution of Adi Shankaracharya for the development of Hindu philosophy. So let us see the proof point. Firstly, again, you can talk about the creation of the development of Advaita Vedanta, a non-dualistic philosophy where absolute Brahman is the ultimate reality. Second, you can talk about there were commentaries on Upanishads such as Upadeshakhari, Viveka Chudamani and Bhaja Govinda Shotra, which provided certain kind of clarification and exposition of Upanishad teachings. Then he also reinterpreted Hindu texts such as Vedas and Bhagavad Gitas and gave us a novel idea and understanding. He also led to establishment of monastic order to propagate the ideas such as mathas at different places, centers for learning and scholarship, and it helped with respect to preservation and spread of Shankaracharya's teaching. So these are the proof points of contribution by Shankaracharya. You can inculcate in the heading 2. Let us see the conclusion, where you can talk about the significance of contribution of Adi Shankaracharya. Over here, you can talk about it how it helped with respect to the idea of development of different schools of Hindu philosophy, especially the evolution of Vedanta. So that is something you can talk about. It also helped with respect to the unification of varieties of Hindu school and thus re-emergence of Hinduism. So that is something you can write in the conclusion as well. So that is all for question number 3. Let us see the model answer and understand how can we inculcate the same in our answer writing practice. Firstly, in the introduction, you can give brief idea about Adi Shankaracharya, the timelines, and what exactly were the contribution of the personality. Then you can talk about the synthesis of ideas and philosophy, which is the major demand, as in the heading 1 for this. Over here, you can list down the proof points. In the heading 2, you have to talk about the contribution of Adi Shankaracharya for the development of Hindu philosophy. So again, you can list down the proof point and provide justification. And in the last, you can talk about the significance of those contribution in the conclusion. So that's all for today's session. Keep writing and thank you so much.